Today I'm here with Mike Maxwell, which might be surprising to some of you who have been following this channel for a little while, because a few years ago we were ideological opponents in a certain regard. I, of course, advocated Platonism. Mike was out there very vocally advocating a pre axial age, pre Platonic version of paganism. And I was convinced that Mike was a Fed because it seemed like he was responding to things that I was saying in my own content, but then not acknowledging that he knew who I was. So I was essentially being schizo, and I took that and ran with it. And also the fact that, of course, he runs Imperium Press, and it is a very Fed-like thing to do to run a publishing agency. Many of them have. So anyway, those two pieces of data led me to make this blanket accusation, which now I severely regret. I understand, this could impact Mike in his business, in how he can grow his social media. So I just want to formally apologize before everyone to Mike. Sorry for fed jacketing you. It is a serious thing, and we should all be more conscientious than that.
Well, first of all, thank you for having me on here, Arval. I really appreciate it. And about all the stuff in the past, look, it is in the past, and I think that both of us are really very much more aligned than we have disagreements. And I think, if I may be so bold, I think we're both doing like very good work that is essential in the community. So, I think that this is a collaboration that is long in coming. A lot of guys probably didn't have that on their dance card for end of 2025, but here it is. And I think the reason, the fact that we are now talking and working together here on this podcast is evidence that we are moving the dialogue, that things are shifting in our direction. And now it's time for us to unify and get serious and really create a kind of parallel structure that will push back against the machine.
Yes, 100%. There are bigger enemies out there, and we don't really have that much time to play around. We do have momentum, and while the conditions are favorable, we really have to make hay while the sun shines. So you're doing that. You're very active. Can you tell us what's going on currently with Imperium Press?
Yeah, absolutely. So, we have really accelerated our release schedule this year. We've been around for about, I guess it's been 6 or 7 years, depending how you reckon it now. And this year, we just put out about 30% of our total releases for all time thus far. So we have really accelerated what we're doing. We put out 36 books this year. And we're trying to get very, very serious about building essentially a parallel structure. In this case, an ideological and academic structure that allows us to push back against the mainstream and inject more folkish ideas into it. So yeah, we put out a ton of books this year. We put out quite a few key works in the last month or so because in the run up to Christmas, this is where a lot of people are buying books. So we put out some real heavy hitters in the last little while. And one of those books, I reserved a key spot for myself for my own book, which is called Tribal Future of the West. It is, of course, about retribalization and what's coming. It's essentially a work of political anthropology, and it's very different than my previous work, which some of the folks out there might be familiar with, the Culture Thug Handbook, which was a summary of essentially the radical right-wing worldview, or worldviews, because it's still a little bit heterogeneous. This book is very different. This book is a much more academic work. It is very much more even-handed in its tone and academic in its approach. So I think people are going to, I think a lot of people are going to hate it, but there are going to be a lot of people who like it. And the reason why I think people are going to hate it is because it's a bit of a cold shower about what's coming. So anyway, that's a summary of what we've been up to lately.
Excellent. No, it sounds like a much needed scholarly work on, I think, just inevitably where we have to go and what's possible and what's not possible in that vein. The other major school of thought is that we should be focused on infiltrating the institutions, taking an entryist tack. And I think there are limitations to what can be accomplished in that vein. We probably could, if we exerted all our efforts, infiltrate the Republican Party. But Republicans are going to lose every election after the next 5 years just because of demographic change. At least that's my interpretation, my take. And of course, all the big money supports a Zionist establishment. I don't see all of that being dethroned, even with enormous popular support. Really, we've seen the data on the fact that politicians are influenced and policy is influenced by the donor class, not by the majority. So even if we get the public on our side, we get the majority of staffers in Washington on our side, that still doesn't necessarily mean that we're going to have an administration that reflects our values. And if we can enter some institutions, I'm also for that. So I'm not an absolutist about any of these paths. So my point in criticizing entryism is that we have to know what's possible and what's not possible. And currently, no one's done that kind of in-depth analysis of what avenues are non-starters and shouldn't be explored. I think local politics, though, there's a lot of possibility there, especially when paired with the strategy that both you and I are for, which is this parallel institution approach. I've advocated for that for many years. I'm curious, how did you first come to think this way? Why did you decide that building parallel institutions, communities, is the way to go?
How did I come to it? That's a good question. I think I came to it really out of praxis. I am very much about praxis now. Anybody who's followed my Substack for any length of time realizes that it's very much focused on theory, uh, essentially developing a theory of what we call folkishness as a worldview. But I believe that praxis comes before theory. I'm sort of a Burkean in this limited sense, I suppose, which is that first you get the tool is developed, and then the theory comes later to sort of explain how that worked. Um, and what I mean by that, I'm talking a little bit abstractly here, is that I started Imperium Press. It began as what I thought was just going to be a little side hustle, like something that like I might put out a few books uh, because I didn't like what was going on inside the academy. I was frustrated that they had essentially denigrated some of the works that I love. And I thought, okay, well, I'll put out a few books and see how it does. And it just exploded. And now it's become what I do for a living. So I saw firsthand that you can do things. You can just do things. You can get out there. You can create in my case, a publishing company that can compete with, Cambridge, Oxford University publishing houses. And so I thought to myself, well, if you can do it in the realm of publishing, why couldn't you do it in other realms as well? And this is something obviously that you and the Return to the Land organization have found in a completely different domain. So it can be done. I saw that it could be done because I did it. And then after that, I think it was after that, I started to really look at the structural factors, the direction that the wind is blowing, and what is moving at the level of like systemic factors to see that these kind of things are necessary and that traditional approaches to fixing problems, things like, entryism, political stuff, and that kind of thing, and especially maybe populist or democratic approaches to these things absolutely would not work. And that you kind of need to have you need to move the center of gravity outside of the mainstream. In my case, with publishing, it needs to move outside of academia. And that is really where that's where the direction that things are going already. So you need to sort of push from outside the system in order to reform the system. And further analysis and thinking about things and reading and just getting familiar with the scope and nature of the problem led me to believe that uh, we are going to actually see a devolution of sovereignty outside of the nation state. We are essentially heading into a post-national future. And there's two directions that this post-national future could go, I guess you could say broadly. Either it could go in a upward direction towards internationalism, which is obviously what the mainstream is aiming for. It's what sort of structurally liberalism has always been geared towards. Or it could go in the other direction. It could go toward a more local and tribal future. And I believe that the tribal future is not only desirable, but it's also really the only future for structural and systemic reasons that I'm sure that we'll talk about.
Well, that's an interesting uh, concept. I've often advocated for, ironically, globalism in the past, not in its current form, but just kind of acknowledging the fact that what these globalist thinkers have been responding to are a set of very real technological issues. Weapons of mass destruction wasn't just a slogan to get us into wars for Israel. There also is a tendency for increasing the potential, the destructive potential of technologies that smaller and smaller states can now employ. John Robb wrote this book, Brave New War, and he's a pretty sound strategist, and I think he was a general, and just kind of observes that as time goes on, destructive potential is larger in the hands of smaller groups. And so necessarily it becomes more and more difficult to get a hold of. Now, the top down approach to that is therefore we need international cooperation. We have to have more surveillance on ordinary citizens, extend that to AI, robotics, genetic engineering. You could engineer bioweapons. There are all sorts of basically terrifying prospects in the technological world of the rest of the 21st century. And if you don't want that stuff to run amok or be out of control, then you kind of take the technocratic, censorious, and surveillance state approach of the mainstream establishment. So that's what they're doing, and I sort of see the logic in it. And I've argued that the nation state, if it remains the locus of power, is an unstable arrangement by nature. Many people think that it's the best we can do in an imperfect world, and it's the only way really to defend our rights. And I see that, but also historically, there have been large imperial structures that have actually protected many nationalities that otherwise would be subject to the whims of their neighbors, right? The Persians actually liberated many peoples who were otherwise oppressed by other less benign powers nearby. The Roman Empire, I think, was largely beneficial. The British Empire was largely beneficial. The American Empire, I think, has yet to be realized. We didn't make that shift. We're still in the American Republic, and then the Caesar will come. I'm talking about my thought years ago, by the way. I don't really subscribe to this whole way of thinking now, just kind of setting the stage. And I want to get your response to this. But we'll have some kind of Caesar, and then American Empire, if it's directed in the right way with the right principles behind it, well, it can actually ensure a peaceful transition into this either transhuman age. And I've never been for transhuman technologies, but I do think they're kind of inevitable. People are already implanting themselves with Neuralink and seeing supposedly cognitive advantages. So I see that continuing. I see AI continuing, maybe not at the same breakneck pace, but it just seems like sort of an inevitability that we'll see a fundamental rupture from the human condition as we've known it. That's with a relatively optimistic take. But it sounds like you see kind of structural issues that will necessitate that globalist approach to the 21st century collapses. Why do you think that is?
Well, there are quite a few reasons. And, so as not to sort of overwhelm the audience with just sprinting through them, I will I'll address the one that you've raised with the technological aspect of warfare. It's interesting that you mentioned Brave New War, John Robb's book, because I drew on that book for a few chapters of my book. And I took so my interpretation of it is that it actually augurs a, again, devolutionary, more localized form of warfare. So warfare has evolved over a number of generations, essentially from Napoleonic warfare, in ways that now favor small actors over big states. Uh, there are 5 generations of warfare that are recognized in the military literature, and Gen 4 and Gen 5, the latest ones, make suppression of small actors expensive and ineffective. It essentially, uh, warfare now asymmetrically favors the insurgent, whereas before it favored more of the incumbent. So let's go very quickly through these generations of warfare just to give the audience a sense of what it is that I mean. So first generation warfare is known as line and column warfare. This is what you would have seen in the 17th century through the early 19th century, where you have like Westphalian armies, musket era formations, excuse me, Napoleonic warfare, where you'd have these lines, massed infantry lines in rigid formations. It was very much based on discipline and drill, with clear uniforms, clear battle lines, and sovereign powers. Before this, you had more feudal warfare, which was much less centralized, but you got the rise of the nation state in this era, essentially because warfare favored it, right? It required state organized armies and taxation and supply chains and all that. And only states could really field disciplined standing armies at this level of this scale that was required. So that's first generation warfare. We kind of know this as, the Revolutionary War in America. Think of tricorner hats and all that. Second generation warfare comes a little bit later, maybe a century or half a century, in the late 19th century through to the mid 20th century. Second gen warfare is industrial, and the paradigm here is World War I, where you get firepower focused trench warfare. So in this, we get massed artillery, machine guns, and now warfare has gone from decisive battles on the field to attrition, right? And this requires an industrial scale. You need logistics and centralized command. You need standardized training. And this favors the state even more because it requires the industrial capacity that only a state can muster, and national mobilization at a massive scale. So this essentially, the smaller actors and what I call para-sovereigns in the book would have been annihilated by industrial firepower. So Gen 2, think World War I. Third generation of warfare is blitzkrieg warfare. So now we move to World War II into the late 20th century, where this is about speed and surprise and mobility and encirclement. This is still very, very much state run and requires an even larger form of organization. It's more agile. It's more about maneuver and things like that. You still need nation states to field the armor and mechanized divisions required to undertake this war. But at this point, you start to see the beginnings of a shift away from this centralization. You get the smaller units that kind of gain some autonomy. Structural, like the structure of military command becomes a little bit decentralized, where instead of having these large scale movements, it's now a little bit more about improvisation, and commanders at the lower level are a little bit more empowered to make decisions on the fly and that sort of thing. It demands initiative, essentially, not just a obedience at the level of the military hierarchy. So it begins a shift, but it still requires at the material level nation states. That's Gen 3, blitzkrieg. Fourth generation warfare is what's called guerrilla warfare. We all know this. This is Vietnam is the paradigm here, where you get state versus non-state conflict, or at least the beginnings of that, war and politics begins to be blurred. Um, War starts to become somewhat ideological. It's still about it again becomes about attrition, but it's sort of about wearing down the society as much as it is wearing down the military. And of course, with guerrilla warfare, you get these dispersed networks, urban combat, and like cells, decentralized cells. Warfare
Mhm.
becomes much more psychological. The battlefront becomes unclear. Rather than having line and column armies facing off, face to face on pitched battles, now the front could be anywhere. Your enemy could be that civilian that's just standing over there. You don't know. So fighters blend into the civilians, and the battlefield is everywhere. And
So, like the War on Terror and the Clash of Civilizations.
yeah, absolutely. So that's more of a late stage of this fourth generation warfare. It begins really, I would say, in Korea. Korea is sort of the cusp between the Blitzkrieg and the guerrilla warfare. And then it continues on to the wars in the 1980s, like Afghanistan, the war with Afghanistan between the Soviet Union, and into the war on terror with like Hezbollah and ISIS, and even you could see the dirty wars that have continued to be waged to this day in places like Mexico with the cartels and things like that. Those are sort of like guerrilla warfare. And the asymmetry of this style of warfare kind of neutralizes state firepower because tanks and jets and artillery are completely useless against dispersed networks that are hiding in dense populations. And as a result of that, you need to win the favor of those populations. So legitimacy becomes more important than territory. Um, Groups win by commanding loyalty. Now, this doesn't mean that we're going back to a kind of like silly populism type thing, but it does mean that you need to win hearts and minds, even if it is of a smaller elite. And the cost of suppressing these things skyrockets because states have to spend enormous resources tracking the small mobile groups that wage guerrilla warfare. And technology begins to empower the small guy with cheap drones, encrypted messaging, IEDs, and things like that. So at this stage of warfare in the fourth generation, we have decidedly moved away from the large state. And you get the emergence of things like what I'm calling parasovereigns, which are non-state actors that essentially exercise sovereign functions. We can get into those functions at some point. But things like justice and welfare and security begin to move outside of the state, or at least the state now has to compete to provide those services.
Like the Muslim Brotherhood in
Yeah, or
Egypt. They
things like
start, yeah.
Hezbollah is a really good example of it as well.
Well, they really
And
became
also,
popular because they offered educational services, hospital services. They were basically functioning in lieu of the state in Egypt when they rose.
exactly. And this is what cartels do as well, right? Like when COVID hit, the um, the cartels in Mexico provided relief, and they also provide a form of welfare and things. And they also tax as well. They do things like, we don't call it taxation. We call it, like, they demand tribute and payments and things like that. But in name, all but in name, it is actually taxation. So this these para sovereigns have started to emerge from the middle of the 20th century to now, and also the growth of urbanization creates an ideal terrain for these para sovereigns to operate. Now, blitzkrieg by the late 20th century is completely obsolete. Cities become these labyrinths of autonomous zones. Um, we now know this, excuse me, politically. This can be seen in the no-go zones. But anyway, to wrap up Gen 4 before we get to Gen 5, this now has decidedly moved away. Like, now warfare asymmetrically favors smaller, more decentralized units. Fifth generation warfare is very interesting. It's what's called information warfare. And this it continues a so if from the first generation to the fourth generation, essentially what you see is a gradual abstraction. You see the abstracting of conflict away from the battlefield, or in a more abstract direction. So in the first generation, excuse me, in the first generation, you are basically going toe to toe with another guy with a musket and a bayonet, right? Like you can see the enemy, you fight him face to face. Second generation, it's less face to face, right? Like this is trench warfare. You're fighting across a no man's land. Third generation, it's more abstracted. You might be fighting, a fighter jet or in a tank or something like that at a distance and like launching rockets across massive distances. In the fourth generation, the battlefield gets yet more abstracted. You might be face to face with your enemy, but you don't know where the enemy is. The battle lines become blurred, right? And in fifth generation warfare, they become completely blurred. Anybody could be an enemy because now warfare is waged over information. This is mimetic warfare, psychological operations, and influence networks count for everything. And now you're fighting. I mean, of course, war will has been and will always be about the use of coercive force, physical force. But now it is more than ever about narrative dominance over territorial dominance. And this is why you see the rise of the meme of misinformation, right? Misinformation is actually a threat to the sovereignty of the center as a result of this. And, you know, fifth generation warfare, which is essentially a war over hearts and minds, even more than fourth gen, uh, it favors the small guy because online tribes, you could say, quote unquote tribes, mobilize much faster than states. And digital anonymity allows small groups to punch massively above their weight. Now you can essentially cost the state millions of dollars in terms of misinformation, as they call it, requiring re-education and everything like that, or even just causing economic problems. Like think of the GameStop thing that happened a few years ago. Now somebody with a laptop can essentially wage fifth gen warfare anonymously from their bedroom. And this generation completely favors the para-sovereign because the battlefield is the mind, not so much the territory. And these para-sovereigns standing outside of the state excel at viral mobilization, forming identities, storytelling, and narrative construction, and ultimately creating loyalty through a shared myth in the Sorelian sense of myth. I don't mean myth as in, the myth of Zeus or whatever, but shared myth in terms of creating a narrative that mobilizes people to do things. So state messaging, by contrast, is slow, it's bureaucratic, it's clunky, nobody believes in it. It has no purchase among people, so it becomes increasingly irrelevant. So to summarize this long tirade, Gen 1 and Gen 2, if the first two generations of warfare made sovereignty centralized, where only states could wage it. The third generation kind of loosened that rigidity, but the state remained ascendant. And Gen 4 and Gen 5 have now actually turned that around, and the sovereignty has become decentralized, where small, adaptive local actors can now defeat and outmaneuver even great powers. So this is just one instance. This is just one particular technological shift and material shift in material conditions that is actually now favoring decentralization over centralization.
Yes, I actually completely agree. By the way, excellent explanation of that. Do you have a podcast?
Yeah, I have a couple of podcasts.
Okay, where can people find that?
So the one podcast I have is Culture Dads with Dave Martell. If you just go to culturedads.com, that's culture with a K, culturedads.com, you'll be able to get some of the podcasts. You can also find us on YouTube if you just Google, or if you just search up that name on YouTube. We've been posting the old episodes for free. I also have speaking of uh, parallel structures, we've created our own podcast platform called hearthfireradio.com, where I have a solo podcast called The Outlander, where I talk a little bit more about like religious stuff and folkishness and things like that. So those are my two podcasts right now.
Excellent. No, I thought that was a brilliant explanation. I thought it is really the lens to look at contemporary politics and what is possible and what is not possible. And that's exactly the lens that I would apply when looking at this question of globalism versus a breakdown into warring fiefdoms, which actually I was seriously concerned about. Like, on the one hand, as dissidents against the power structure in some sense, I can see how it benefits us. All of these tendencies, in principle, benefit us, where we can get our voice out there, we can build our networks in a way that is not really under the thumb of the establishment in the way that they used to have it, where there were 5 networks and they basically mind controlled the population. Now there are infinitely many networks, and we can also, in terms of financial technologies, build parallel currencies, cryptocurrencies that are totally out of the reach in some ways of the establishment. But on the other hand, the possibilities that that opens up do actually sincerely frighten me, just on the basis of the destructive potential of some of these technologies, especially bioengineering. I don't want the cartel to start messing with that kind of technology. I don't want Al Qaeda, for that matter, or Israel, some rogue state like the Zionists, to mess with technology that might get out of hand. Some people think that and I shouldn't say this on YouTube, but a recent virus was actually engineered in some sense. And we do research on improving the viral capacities of these, germs or viruses. And, what does that entail? Like, going forward, the odds that one of these threats spikes and becomes pandemic level or extinction level conceivably just increases the more technology goes. If that's the future, it may be good for us in like the midterm, where okay, we get our own power centers potentially because states are breaking down, global rule is breaking down. But then don't we just drive ourselves to extinction? And then on the other side of that, this is why I've said, like, I don't want to overthrow the government. I believe that essentially the establishment as it exists is reasonable at its core. Maybe it has a lot of nefarious actors filling their ranks currently. We have to drain the swamp, etc. But only they, the Five Eyes, the Anglo-American establishment, only they can actually rein in this kind of technology. And today, also with AI, they're building massive data centers. So if it's an information war, they have access to all the information, and it is kind of re-centralized. So at the same time, there are centrifugal tendencies that seem beneficial to small actors like us, and then there are also, or rather, centripetal tendencies, and then centrifugal tendencies, which only the establishment has. And AI, especially, I think, is this like end all be all centralizing influence where you can't just open up your own data center that costs tens of billions of dollars and uses the energy of small cities. So, what about that dynamic? I guess it's a two-pronged question. If this is the battle line, and we're dealing with localism versus basically the Anglo-American establishment, because there's no other competent rival still, maybe China one day, but if that's the battle line, doesn't them not winning, the establishment not winning, kind of mean we live in chaos and we're probably going back to the Stone Age or something similar? And then also, yeah, like, don't they have an edge because of AI and centralized data centers and the ability to deplatform people still if they want to? Those two questions.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a valid concern, and actually, I devote a chapter in the book to the centralizing counter forces that are moving against the centrifugal forces that one of which I've just laid out there earlier. So I do go over these. There's essentially two that you've uh, pointed to. Let's take AI first, for example. So, AI has all these two tools available to the central authority, like for mass data analysis, things like facial recognition, predictive policing, and all that. Like they can algorithmically track people's sentiments. It's very easy to moderate social media content, to like deplatform actors that they deem to be dangerous. And this, of course, does strengthen centralization, very much so, because it expands the state monitoring capacity. It also is able to automate tasks that previously required these large bureaucracies. So, actually, the bureaucracy itself, technocracy, is a centralizing force. But in tandem with that, AI makes it very, very easy for them to operate, right? And it allows small elite groups to control these large populations. And I think another strength, I'm just trying to steel man the argument here. Um, Another strength is that it provides a kind of force multiplier that makes the government, the machinery of government, very, very efficient, right? So that's AI. Now let's take surveillance, which kind of works in tandem with AI. So surveillance strengthens centralization by, I guess you could say, identifying the threats before they mobilize, by disrupting these threats and deterring them and sort of breaking them up before they get too big, whether they are insurgent groups on the fringes or ideological opponents such as the dissident right or even organized crime going much further. It makes mass mobilization against the state harder, and that is ultimately what they fear. They fear a mass mobilization of the white identity movement, basically, right? So surveillance enhances the state's ability to project force into these enclaves of parasovereigns, what I'm calling. Now, I think the problem there is that surveillance doesn't actually eliminate the threats. It can buy the state time. It can fragment them into smaller cells, but then these cells become actually harder to trace. And also, it collapses legitimacy. Legitimacy is so, so important to the state because legitimacy is essentially an efficiency tool. It's like an efficiency coefficient of how the state is able to operate. If you are operating in a low legitimacy environment, it's very, very expensive and resource intensive. We can talk about that maybe in a bit. But surveillance completely collapses legitimacy because the more people sense that they're monitored, the more they will adopt things like what you mentioned, encrypted channels, cryptocurrencies. They might get like a burner phone, or the more that decentralized networks start to crop up, you might get things like dark web marketplaces. Essentially, what happens is surveillance pushes these parasovereigns into more distributed and resilient forms. So the devolutionary implication of the surveillance state is that it actually accelerates parasovereigns to transform into these agile cell-based actors. Again, we're back to the Gen 4 and Gen 5 warfare thing. It makes people paranoid. It makes them cynical against the state. It completely enhances resistance, and it weakens the state's moral authority. So that's surveillance, and AI is very similar because AI is basically a tool to increase efficiency, but not legitimacy. And again, legitimacy is what's pushing back against the efficient, state capacity. So when the state uses these opaque algorithmic tools, public trust drops very, very quickly. And it's worth sort of digressing very briefly here that we now live in a a situation where nobody can believe anything. It's what I called on my Substack the epistemic divorce. Take the recent revelations of like Trump with the Epstein files, right? There's some really just horrific stuff in there, like things that have come out that should completely delegitimize Trump. But now all people have to do, and they will do this, you'll see, is they'll say, "Oh, it's just an AI deep fake," or they're lying, or even if video comes out about like this terrible thing that he was supposedly did, people will just say, "Oh, it's a deep fake." Like AI completely collapses our public spaces and has like balkanizes epistemology into these little micro fragments. So now people don't believe in the central authority. They don't believe in anything that they don't believe in shared big narratives anymore, essentially. So when the state uses these tools, and when these tools become widely available, public trust absolutely collapses. And AI centralization is also matched by AI decentralization. Now, of course, you need to have computing power in reserve. Obviously, Chat GPT is something that can only exist as essentially as a state aligned initiative, but para-sovereigns use their own AI tools. There are such things as open source AI, and perhaps as quantum computing becomes a thing, this may level the playing field a little bit more. So yeah, I mean, you get like encrypted AI models, deep fakes, and bots and anonymization. Actually, AI, I think enhances both sides and not just the state. I think it still favors the state, but not as much as people think, and it also collapses legitimacy. So it accelerates this fragmentation of reality that I've described. It strengthens the center, but it also strengthens its enemies simultaneously, and this actually leads to a kind of escalation rather than stabilization. And that escalation further pushes down legitimacy, and governing in a low legitimacy environment is very difficult and fraught, and it's just fragile. It makes the system more fragile rather than less.
Yeah, I'm very sympathetic to your response to that fork. And I have, over the past 5 years, kind of came around to the fact that decentralized networks are strengthening us, are weakening establishment narratives, and also hyperpolarization is built into the incentive structure of most possible social media. It's not just a feature of the establishment manipulating the algorithms. They are designed, these networks are sort of just by nature going to fragment in exactly the ways that you're saying. And I believe in game theory more strongly than I believe in the Anglo American establishment. But doesn't necessarily help me with my concerns about the first prong. So you've blackpilled me on the possibility of American empire winning this conflict. We're going to fragment, we're going to go local. Okay, I'll buy that, at least for now. And but what about the like terrifying future entailed by that? Is there any way that decentralized networks and groups, para sovereigns that are part of our networks, will be able to moderate some of the destructive potential of very small groups all around the world?
Yeah. Well, I mean, this is the excuse me, this is the $1 million question, and I think they can only really be answered in broad strokes in a public environment. That is to say that we need to build intentional communities that are anti-fragile and resilient and are able to push back against these things. Um, and these are discussions that kind of like the specifics of like what do we do in this particular circumstance. Those discussions kind of need to be had behind closed doors. But I think the important thing to see is that we need to start doing these things. If normal people and not criminals are going to be able to push back and not be sort of driven across the landscape and become chattel for these para sovereigns, we kind of need to start doing these things. I actually gave a speech at a conference recently called Exiles of the Golden Age back in July this year, where the speech was titled "Why Manor Buns," and I was arguing essentially that we need manor buns now, like we've never needed them before, precisely because of this devolutionary future. So essentially, what we need to do is have normal people who are creating intentional communities in the midst of modernity, need to retribalize, right? And this involves a whole shift in worldview. It's not just we need to stick together. We need actually to develop a worldview that sees the horizon of care as much smaller than it has ever been before. This is why I'm saying like that the post-national future, or that the future is not nationalist. It's post-nationalist.
Wow.
It's more local. It's
Okay.
more all these
So
things.
so essentially I'm getting we are headed for the apocalypse. All of us need to live in off-grid communities with our own Iron Dome systems. Is that it?
Well, I mean, I wouldn't put it that dramatically in terms of the collapse. I do think that things are going to get worse. I mean, I would be lying if
Hmm.
I said otherwise. But let's just talk about the collapse for a moment. Um, I don't like the word collapse because it calls to mind men among the ruins, wandering in the aftermath of some sort of apocalyptic, confrontation or whatever. I think what's going to happen is what John Michael Greer calls stepwise collapse. I don't know if he uses that word, but that's the word I use to talk about what he's saying, which is to say that collapse does not happen all at once. These great systems of modernity are not going to implode in some sort of dramatic event, but they're going to contract in stages where you're going to see things, and you are seeing things get worse. We are less poor, or sorry, we're more poor than our grandparents, in terms of things that matter, like real, actual social capital. We are much poorer in that sense, even though we might be slightly richer in a material sense, or maybe a lot richer, depending on how you look at it. We certainly, it's harder to afford a home and all that. But anyway, we are worse off than our grandparents, and this is a contraction that's sort of like just happened over the last few generations. And what's going to happen is that you're going to see these contractions and then a stabilization. Things are going to start to level out for a little while. There's going to be another contraction, another leveling out, and that's going to keep going and going and going like that. And then at some point, the generations much further down the line are going to look back and say, wow, that was now what we call a collapse, or the fall of the empire, or whatever. Each
Hmm.
step along the way might be triggered by something like a financial shock, or I also believe that we're going to have a lot of problems in terms of energy. This is sort of the energy issue, is the through line that unites a lot of the material causes and even some of the social causes as well. But there's going to be a crisis that the system essentially can't absorb. It will not be able to solve that problem at the existing level of complexity. So complexity is going to shift downward. And after each of these downshifts, the system will stabilize. It'll, will come to a sort of plateau, and it will feel like a recovery, but it'll be an incomplete recovery. We will recover at a lower level of technical and political or social complexity, kind of like Rome losing provinces one by one. Nobody at the time of the fall of the Roman Empire said that the empire is falling. But all that happened was your boss all of a sudden became much more local. You were answering to like a local potentate rather than a provincial governor or something like that, or you were answering to a provincial governor and not the imperial center. And this kept happening, right? Like the municipal bankruptcies, were followed by reduced services. I'm still talking about Rome here, and cities retreated to core functions and abandoned the peripheries. You can think of the abandonment of the British Isles, for example. So each step along the way will reduce complexity, scale will go down, capacity will go down, and at each stage, society will lose competence, essentially. And this is another thing you can see is the competence crisis that's currently happening. This is a symptom of what I'm talking about. We are actually in the midst of one of these downgrades at the moment. So
Mhm.
infrastructure may not be maintained as it once was. Law enforcement may not reach as far as it once did. Public services get worse. I've noticed this here in Australia where I live. I had kids in the last 10 years. And when I had to go to the hospital with my youngest, or sorry, my eldest, it was like we got in, I wouldn't say right away. It only took a couple of hours for us to really get treated. Now that's a half day or maybe, a 18-hour ordeal. It's absolutely abhorrent. Public services are contracting. Um, elite unity will also weaken. You can see this right now. This is what's happening with America First insurgency into the Republican Party. Fiscal capacity will decline. Cohesion will go down. This is what the reduction in complexity looks like. It will at some point stabilize, will feel like the worst is over, but it'll just keep going like that. And this process is largely irreversible because once competencies are lost, once you lose institutional memory and trust and all of that, it's very hard to rebuild these things. So each step sort of tightens this downward spiral, and the system becomes progressively more and more brittle. First, you'll feel it at the periphery, in rural areas. We, of course, see this all across the United States, and we've been seeing it for a generation in rural areas. And then you're going to start to see it happen in cities. Criminal enclaves begin to arise. Um, Administrative withdrawal starts to happen. And then we get this inward move toward the center where the state really just sort of focuses on these, uh, its strongholds essentially. And you get this mosaic pattern of uneven decline. Um, so the center will survive the longest until it just can't. And essentially what you'll be left with after, a period of centuries, I'm not a prophet. I can't make predictions with any real degree of accuracy, but let's just say after a couple of centuries, it'll probably look something much more medieval than it once did. Now we're not going to have castles or knights or anything like
I mean,
that,
we're gonna have
but we
we're gonna have
have,
castles here, but yeah, speak for
well, I hope
yourself.
so. I would love to have castles, but we are going to have overlapping jurisdictions and essentially like a feudalized social structure. So that is the final stage of relocalization, and I think that that's what we're heading towards. So I don't like to call it collapse. I really think it's feudalization is a better word for it because collapse is too dramatic and it seems ridiculous and it's not accurate. So that's why I don't use it.
Yeah, right. I was being hyperbolic, but I think that's in line with my understanding of the historical dynamics at play as well. Although sometimes there is a complex of complex or a collapse of complex systems, and one critical system fails, leading to just widespread chaos very quickly, like the Bronze Age collapse. First, environmental crises drove one population, probably from Italy, and then into Greece and breaking up some of the autarkies there, and then leading to more movement of people, and it just sort of cascaded. So sometimes it moves quickly. I wouldn't hazard a guess. I mean, I do sympathize again with this whole line of thought. It's what I more or less thought the future would look like from 2012, just in my own biography. I was expecting this kind of collapse of complex systems or a stepwise decline in living standards until I guess around 2021, 22. Um, I believed more in the system. They seemed to have more resilience than I anticipated. I still wouldn't completely rule them out. And I see essentially one way where centralizing forces can really hold the line, and that is by them pushing that populist message or a popular message among aspiring elites that gives them legitimacy in the key demographics. And that could happen by, you know, counter intel agents infiltrating movements on the right and subverting them, Or it could happen by the elites just putting forward a better alternative and being upfront and straightforward. I basically ruled that out. A third way is the Bukele option. So you have some states that are small enough with a highly aligned population where they can capitalize on a lot of these decentralized technologies in a centralized way. It's like larger firms. If there's a trade off where sometimes smaller actors are more agile, they can adapt to new technologies and update their systems faster than huge actors. But then there are some things where centralization really helps, and especially being a state actor really helps when you have this high degree of legitimacy. Or I guess the secret fourth option is what they are talking about with these smart cities where a bunch of rich people buy an island in the Mediterranean and set up utopia. So that's sort of the Constantinople in the middle of the Dark Ages, being that city on a hill. But to me, like the potential disparity there just seems so severe. Like, could we enter a world where El Salvador's standard of living is far, far above that of the United States as we balkanize and break up, and the office of county sheriff becomes far more relevant than a U.S. senator? Meanwhile, Bukele's heirs are reigning over their enlightened hereditary monarchy and inventing the new tech with the advantage of huge computer centers fueling their AI efforts. It's like there's got to be a sweet spot of exactly how centralized or how decentralized. Like three guys talking online in their own decentralized network is not that potent. For me, it really comes down to what's the size of social entity necessary to drive further technological progress. Because one thing about the Dark Ages, actually, we invented a lot of stuff. It was a highly innovative time in terms of mathematics. The 11th century, we got the first advances beyond basically Archimedes that had been accomplished in 1,000 years. The last 500 years of Rome was intellectually pretty barren. Most of the stuff happened in the second century BC. So the fact that society was highly ordered didn't necessarily drive innovation. The Dark Ages, with the universities, you did see a new degree of progress on a scientific front, and that was a combination of decentralizing and centralizing forces, where politically it was more decentralized, but theologically and ideologically it was more centralized. And that's another thing. There's both forces in decentralized networks. In some sense, it's as if the truth is able to rise to the top. And actually, we see memes going viral and dominating popular consensus and really significantly changing mass opinion in short order. So those two tendencies I do see in the medieval period as well. But I guess my question is, what is the geopolitical landscape when you have the smart city Constantinople's, you have the enlightened despot El Salvador future, and then you also have more balkanized states like maybe the US would become. I used to have so much more confidence in our elites. And by elites, I mean like both Jewish and Gentile elites. Like I thought they were genuinely highly intelligent. And now I see that, okay, they've been declining over the past generations. And when I read some of these authors from the past that were elites, we're not dealing with the same caliber of men these days. And then the other question is China. So, what about that geopolitical context? Again, we have like three or four basic classes. Whatever China becomes, I'd be interested to hear what you would expect in China. The El Salvador option, the smart city option, and then the balkanized option. How do those interact?
So it's interesting that you have actually laid all those out. because that maps, maybe not perfectly, but like pretty nicely onto essentially three scenarios that I lay out towards the end of the book. The first one is full fragmentation. I guess we've already kind of talked a little bit about that. That's one possibility. Another possibility is hybrid sovereignty. So this is kind of like somewhere between fragmentation and the next one, which is a full re-centralization. Now, just to give you the punchline up front, I don't think that any of these scenarios are going to materialize in their entirety. It's going to be messy. There's going to be, fragmentations and then attempts at centralization that are partial and then aborted, and you see hybrid sovereigns and then more decline, and then maybe a real re-centralization under a charismatic leader. Like, it's going to be complicated. But that doesn't really say much. I think it's complicated is a bad answer. So let's talk, I guess, first about the option that you mentioned, where essentially it's like a populist government, the attempt to inject populism into say the American Republic, like the Republican Party in America or something like that. This depends on a kind of elite unity, like if you had a base Tony Blair or something like that. Let's just say that's the vision, if I'm not mistaken. So this depends on elite unity, and elite fragmentation is a problem. It is not a side effect. It's not something that's just happening because of the lack of will. This is a big part of how sovereign decline happens. Um, we all know that when the elites lose cohesion, the state kind of loses its ability to command loyalty and to think and act as a camp. And what's happened is that over the 20th century, the old unified managerial elite has completely shattered. Western governance relied during that time on a unified elite that went to the same schools, uh, moved in the same circles, had the same worldview, had the same class interests, and grew out of the same managerial culture. This elite completely dominated. Like, just read what's the Burnham book, the Managerial Class or something. I forget what it's called. He explains how this is basically the new elite, right? And we all know this. These are the technocrats. And that unity is now gone. There are incompatible elite blocks that are moving in the modern world. You've got the globalist transnational elite. You've got a nationalist or populist elite. You've got this managerial professional elite, people who staff NGOs and bureaucracies and things. You got a techno elite, Silicon Valley class, elite, Elon Musk and Larry Ellison and everything like that. And you've got even like weirder people on the outside that are more about like crypto and decentralized platforms and things. You've also got cultural elites in the universities and the media. And then I guess you could say you've got people within the security state bureaucracy, right? These factions in across the West, I was going to say in America, but everywhere, they don't agree on what legitimacy even means, much less how to get it, or what the nation is in the first place. There's like an ontological disagreement on what constitutes America, or what progress looks like, or who the people are, or any of that stuff. And this is being, I'm just focusing on the elite, potential re-centralization in the West. We'll move on to Bukele in a minute. This elite fracture is driven by what Peter Turchin calls elite overproduction, right? Where essentially what happens is a game of musical chairs where there are much too few chairs and too many players in the game. And when the music stops, some people are left without a seat. So they are frustrated about that, and then they move outside of the elite and they form a counter elite, and this drives further fracture. There are too many. This is built into the structure of liberalism as an ideology. It is essentially a form of rule by Machiavellian foxes, and Machiavellian foxes have multiplied to a degree that is now absurd. There are too many elite educated aspirants, too many credentialed professionals, too many cultural influencers, lawyers, academics, think tank bureaucrats, billionaires. There are too many of these people and just not enough seats of power. So this overproduction, which is driven by the very ideology of liberalism, has produced factional structure at the systemic level. When elite numbers exceed elite opportunities, they fight each other. And this is what's happening right now. This is what's driving the culture war. It's actually it's not the polarization of the mass. It's an elite civil war that's happening right now. And when the this overproduction is now creating new counter elites. Musk is a good example, a very obvious example, right? Or you could think of people like Rupert Lowe in the in the UK, or even people like David Starkey. These are people who are part of the traditional elite that broke away and have now turned on the narrative. And when the elites split, what happens is the population splits with them, because I just take it almost as axiomatic that elite theory is true. Ordinary people do not produce mass movements. They don't polarize or move as a team spontaneously. This is elite driven. And so each elite faction is now cultivating its own sort of tribe, and public trust is collapsing because nobody can agree who the legitimate elite even is. One group
Hmm.
says courts are neutral, another one says they're corrupt. One side says the election is fair, the other one says it was rigged. Once you get these rival elite blocs, which again are driven by the very nature of liberalism itself, sovereignty can no longer hold. So elite fragmentation is kind of the driving force of political destabilization, and it's driven by the very nature of liberalism. So in my view, and this is why Imperium has the editorial stance it does, which is illiberal, we need to look towards illiberal solutions because liberalism is just, it is the problem. It is what has got us here. And the re-centralization is only going to come from something like the Bukele option, right? I'm just thinking, should we talk about? Yeah, let's just talk. We'll talk about that, because you also mentioned things like special economic zones and smart cities and things like that. That would be more of a hybrid sovereignty. But anyway, let's talk about the re-centralization under a charismatic or strongman elite, right? This, I think, is a much better option. I just don't think it's going to happen in the West because we are too far down the liberal rabbit hole. But essentially, this happens as a result of a mass desire for order. Once again, the man in the street is not sovereign. He is not the one that's driving things, but large populations create a kind of inertial force that can be weaponized by elites. So what the man in the street believes and wants actually does matter. Now, he's not going to make it happen. An elite's going to make it happen, but his discontent can be mobilized, essentially. And what happened in Honduras, right, is that people just got so sick of the endemic cartel and gang warfare and everything like that, that it created a space where somebody like a Bukele could come in. So after chaos, or amid chaos, populations will support almost any power that promises security. And in some ways, the West is actually kind of ripe for this, at least for the moment, because of its aging demographics. Usually, older societies prefer stability over change, right? This is why the boomer is, as one of our authors, Nima Parvini, says, believes in the boomer truth regime, right? The World War II myth, essentially. So instability could catalyze the acceptance of authoritarian measures. Basically, the public could demand a Leviathan, right? This could also happen as a result of an external threat. China, as you mentioned, we can talk about China in a bit, But a rising foreign power like China may actually push us to unity in the West,
Hmm.
because the external danger, basically, the political formula becomes centralize or die, essentially. So, and centralizers will very often manufacture or amplify threats to justify this consolidation. You could think of the Gulf of Tonkin incident or anything like that. So this kind of depends upon the creation of an ideological hegemony. We in the West are very creed oriented. I think probably Latin Americans much less so, but we kind of need to have that ideology that will justify unity, whether it's religious or technocratic or nationalist, or I mean, maybe even environmentalist might be another one. Once a new political formula crystallizes, then centralization becomes morally sanctioned, and you could get something like a strong man that promises order and things like that. An example in the not too distant past would be somebody like Kemal Ataturk or something like that, or the Soviet Union was another example, right? So this is a potentiality in the West, but essentially that potentiality will only be realized if liberalism is jettisoned. And this is part of the reason why Imperium, why we were so much for things like absolutism, or I personally regard absolutism as the political paradigm that makes the most sense analytically to me. The idea that the sovereign is above the law because the law can't rule by itself; it has to be essentially personalized, like ruled by a
Well,
person rather than a system.
for a different reason, Plato also thinks that the sovereign is above the law because the lawgiver is above the law. The law is like encoded wisdom of people who have ruled in the past. So, at any given point in time, if you have the true statesman, that person's beliefs are actually more valuable than whatever the law may be.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we're definitely in agreement there. And this is why we've been putting out folks like Jean Baudin and Robert Filmer for many years, is because that makes a lot more sense than the idea that the law can sort of rule in abstract, right? Um, so in any case, I think we need to move toward that. And this is part of the this is essentially part of the project that Imperium has embarked upon, and it has actually had a surprising amount of influence out there. That not a month goes by that I don't get contacted by an academic that basically says what you're doing is good and necessary and keep going, right? So that fills me with like it just keeps me going, kind of thing.
Right.
So anyway, it's possible that we could get a re-centralized regime. The geopolitical context may call for it with the rise of China and Russia and things like that, but it's going to have to move outside of this proceduralist, bureaucratic, managerial elite, and it is essentially going to have to look like a kind of dynastic nationalism. If
Possibly.
it's
What about more of like a meritocratic technocracy, just ruled by the scientific class? I feel like that is what the left believes now. Like, I believe in the science. Anthony Fauci was their gospel during COVID. And that sort of resembles what you're talking about. That's what I believed the globalist Anglo American establishment types were trying to set up to move away from liberalism towards a more meritocratic, technocratic, uh, you know, dictatorship of the scientist class. Do you think there's any hope in that?
No, I don't. Now, I'm not anti-meritocracy at all. I kind of am. I polemically, like, take a dump on meritocracy quite a lot because I think it's a bit of an empty concept. Most of the, if you look across the historical record, the most impressive civilizations are almost unanimously ruthlessly nepotistic. Like Rome was that. It's it's actually hard for me to take meritocracy seriously on its own terms, because I think that if you look at merit, that nepotism is very good. But I do understand in the abstract, I do understand the argument. Obviously, you can't be just giving sinecures to your cousin forever, otherwise you are going to lose competence. But I would, over meritocracy, which I think kind of poisons the well a little bit. It's like sort of a self congratulation of you know, label that the left gives to itself, kind of like the Enlightenment was a few centuries ago. I would characterize it as an impersonalist worldview, not so much a meritocratic worldview. It's a worldview that sees the world and even people as kind of devoid of agency. This is why the left likes to think in systems. This is why the left
Hmm.
believes that material conditions push reality forward as opposed to the great men of history. The left sees agency, like when the right looks out in the world, even metaphysically, it sees agency. This is why we're religious, is because we look at the world and we see that it's populated by intelligences, or maybe one intelligence at least. We see agency everywhere we look, and that's also part of why we're conspiratorial, which is a label that I own. I think we are conspiratorial, and this is the sort of defective half of our agentic or personalist worldview, right? So the left
Hmm.
kind of sees the world in terms of structures that are self-moving and self-governing, kind of like a deist god. Like Schmidt made that point in political theology, which is that the left basically sees the world as like it's the political um, version of the deist idea of the clockwork god. That's what the left believes. Now, there's a
Well,
problems
they're
with that.
building that is the thing. They're very
Yeah,
actively building that, and then we'll worship it and we'll follow it, not as a person, but as an intelligence devoid of personality. So maybe it's not a class of experts, but I just the only way I can see that going is they'll have their so-called AGI system that is the credible scientific voice, and then they'll run society accordingly. And I can see that actually working. I think a lot of people are effectively brainwashed, or it's possible to brainwash them using current AI systems. Like people fall, even intelligent people, basically fall in love with some of these systems and get very wrapped up in what they can do. So like that's a little bit more quasi personalistic. What do you think about that possibility? The whether it's a genuine AGI or not, some entity, some algorithm is given the reins.
well, I'm certainly not anti AI. I use AI for quite a few things. It is a useful tool, absolutely, but as a panacea and a one size fits all solution, I don't think it really works. One of the issues now, I'm certainly not a computer scientist, so I'm not speaking from uh, experience or an academic background in any of these things, but my understanding of one of the key problems with AI that may actually be insoluble is that it requires a data set. Of course, what AI is fundamentally is a language model, right? And it requires input. It requires a set of training data. And what's happening now is that AI systems are increasingly having difficulty getting access to unpolluted training data, right? All the training data out there now is infected with AI content. So as AI trains itself on its own data, it becomes increasingly detached from reality and sort of gets into this weird sort of, it becomes more and more spooky and bizarre, and it doesn't actually do what it's supposed to do, which is to
Yeah.
model natural
A
language.
quick
So I,
quick rebuttal though. There's more and more real world data being fed through cameras, our phones, and increasingly robots, which are using these AI models and which are interfacing and getting real tactile feedback from the world. So that could be error correction.
well, it could be, and I mean, but it's they're still getting data that has AI built into it. Now, I think one AI system that might be somewhat immune to that would be Grok. I think that Twitter is doing the right thing by essentially making its, like, it uses its own platform as the training set for Grok in addition to other things. And that training set is closed off. It's not public. You can't like publicly Google every single tweet that ever existed. So Grok actually has a bit of an edge there in terms of its natural language model. Um, I don't want to get too much into the weeds of, like, whether AI is feasible. Like, let's just say that it is. I still think that the left, in terms of its ideological orientation with its impersonalist worldview, has a few key problems. And these key problems stop it from being able to do what the right can do with its agentic personalist worldview.
Can
One of the
Musk do
problems.
it though with AI, with
Sorry?
his AI? Can Musk do it though, if not the left?
I think Musk could do it, but the key is that Musk could do it, not Grok, right?
Right.
Because the impersonalist worldview has like some serious issues. Like, it is, by its very nature, it's blind to will. It interprets, like, when if the left were to interpret all conflict as structural, which it does, you kind of systemically underestimate intentionality of the opposition, right? This is why the left is like, this is why the populist right has come out of nowhere in its view. And another problem that is, I think, also perhaps less endemic to the left that you could say about maybe something like Grok is that these systems depend on the legibility of uh, you know unquantifiable things, right? The reign of quantity, essentially. These systems thinking requires that you are able to manage what cannot ultimately be measured, right? So these systems are sort of more quantitative in their approach, but really, I think what's the qualitative is more decisive. Things like culture, faith, and like loyalty in institutions is something that's very, very hard to it's very hard to take into account unless you are a will, like an actual will, like a person or a god or something like that. This is not something that a machine can really do, I believe. Um, and there's all kinds of problems that, like, so basically the left, or let's just say the managerial elite, I just don't think it has it in it to be the solution to this problem. And this is why Trump is untouchable in in the in politics, essentially, is because he represents the return of will in politics. I've actually got an article or a series of articles that'll come out in a couple weeks about how, and I'm actually following a guy by the name of Paul Scalise here, but I believe I've gone beyond what he says, in that Trump represents the return to oral culture as opposed to literate culture. So Trump, I mean, he represents it, but this is something, excuse me, this is something that's happening more broadly in the Zoomer online right. Basically, literacy is declining. And as a result, literacy completely colors and even in some ways determines our categories of thought. And it's to kind of skip over the details. What we're going into is a more agonistic and in some ways Homeric world of politics as like friend enemy kind of situation. And Trump he excels at that. He's able to run circles around his opponents when it comes to these kind of things. And I think that this is something that only a human can do.
Mm.
It's going to be very hard for machines to do that. Now, AI is
Yeah.
obviously very adept when it comes to language, but it's not really adept when it comes to original thought or improvisation and thinking outside the box. This is only something that a person can do, and this is why Trump is so attractive to us. And even though Trump is not he's not the sovereign that we asked for. He is a kind of, John the Baptist to Christ. He's like, I am pointing the way to the next guy. He is an augur of what's coming, which is a more personalist, um, charismatic leadership. And I just don't see AI as being able to do that, nor Elon Musk, because he's not that charismatic, as brilliant as he is.
AI couldn't, but AGI by definition could, because it can solve any problem that a human can solve, but better. So influencing, mass opinion, improvising on the spot, all of those things, definitionally an AGI could do, which is kind of the trick. So the question of all questions in this political age is AGI possible? Unfortunately, I believe it probably is. And I don't expect us to hit some invisible wall in AI development. And so basically, I do expect Elon Musk to introduce the AI beast system for him to be the Antichrist, and then for all of apocalypse events to proceed as planned in the Book of Revelation. But we'll have to see. I wrote an article for Arctos, basically outlining it, and I still think that's probably what we're going to see here in the not too distant future. I don't see those hyper charismatic individuals though on the right beyond Trump that we would need to have that kind of personalistic new Caesar. For me, actually, Musk using Grok with all of, he essentially may have bought AGI for $40 billion. People said that he didn't just buy X, he bought, control of the U.S. federal government. Maybe the play was way deeper than that, and it was all about the right training data. I can definitely see all of that coming together, and I can see more people being more influenced by AI. Like young kids are very often raised now largely by AIs that they're chatting with. They have AI chatbots that they feel like are their friends. And I think, obviously, you would never raise your children that way. I wouldn't. I let them interface with AI to ask questions about history and science and stuff. And I'm there to fact check the answers and make sure everything's, toward and not untoward. But I think these changes are happening in the way that children are being raised, in the way that we think of technology. So I wouldn't underestimate the systems mentality or the depersonalized intelligence, because it'll simulate a personality really effectively. And we see that with the deep fakes. We see that with the AI slop. When I'm going through and looking at memes now, you just don't know. I mean, some guy in the comments is still able to be like, "Hey, look at this edge on the cat's leg. It's AI." And then I go back and like, "Oh, you're right." And if you look carefully, it's identifiable, but it's blended what is authentic and personal and real with that domain of the simulacrum in a way that's so uncanny. It doesn't. I'm definitely ambivalent and not certain. I'm agnostic about this future. I can see it going more hard right, and obviously Bukele. That's what that is. I don't see that in the U.S. I don't see the character who emerges to be that. For me, it's almost like the AGI is more believable. But then that would lead us into a whole different domain of discussion, not about political theory, but more about what is intelligence, such that we can even make that call. And many people think it's a technological question, but I think it's deeper than that. It's a philosophical question of what is necessary for intelligence. And people will say, well, an AI doesn't have will, and it can't cut through the explosion of options in considering any given problem by looking for salient information. That's what allows us to be efficient. We hone in on what is relevant. And AI has been able to do that really effectively, where people will ask really misguided prompts, sometimes messy prompts, and AI will be like, I see what you mean. It hones in on the relevant information already. And people will say, well, it doesn't have a will, so it can't seek new information or ask for questions. But when you ask it a prompt, it will ask itself a series of questions to look for the right information to get to the right answer. So it does. Maybe it's not will, but if will is in all things, if there are gods in all things, like Thales said, then maybe there are gods or daimons in AI too. And then what? And maybe it's not so impersonal after all? But again, that's a very different philosophical question. We would have to actually touch on the Platonism versus Homerism side of our ideological divide. But we're far more aligned on the geopolitical analysis and all of that. We didn't even get into the right prescriptions. Like, okay, what do we do about it? How do we build these communities? And I wanted to have that discussion too. So this has been very fruitful. I would like to go ahead and cut it off now because I think it's a lot to digest, and we could easily have two separate conversations on those two equally weighty topics. But Mike, it's been a real pleasure. Again, I'm sorry for writing you off before. You have a great head on your shoulders, and I think more people should be hearing your analysis because I think it is the right way to approach what's going on in the 21st century. So to close, any last thoughts, and then tell people again where they can find you.
Well, I'd just like to close by saying thank you. Thank you for reaching out. Thank you for extending the olive branch and bridging this gap, because I think it is a collaboration between the two of us that is fruitful and that is sort of should have happened much earlier. And I really appreciate it. It was very gracious of you to reach out to me. And this has been a wonderful conversation. It's just the beginning, I think, of a conversation that needs to be had. I agree. It would be awesome to talk about solutions. My podcast partner on Culture Dads, Dave Martell, has done a lot of thinking about these solutions in terms of what he calls folk futurism. So he is a good one to talk to about this as well. But it's been a wonderful conversation. I think we've really gotten somewhere. I hope that the audiences got something out of it as well. And if you guys to find me, you can, of course, find Imperium Press at imperiumpress.org. We've got quite a bit that's come out if you haven't seen us in a year or even a few months. And if you want to find my podcasts, you can find them on that website. If you want to find some great heathen content and generally pagan content, you can go to hearthfireradio.com. We've got a dozen shows now that are posting multiple times a week. So we have created our own podcast platform. It's not quite a social media platform in that it's not like a Web 2.0 anybody can post like Twitter or Spotify, but it is a podcast platform, a little bit more like a podcast version of Netflix. Lots of content coming out there, and I'm very excited about it. And it is another parallel structure. So with that, I mean, we can sort of leave that as a teaser for the next chat. We're going to have to build these parallel structures. They're already in place, and I'm actually very excited for the future in terms of focus. Intentional communities. So once again, thank you very much, Arval. I appreciate it. It's been a wonderful talk, and I'm looking forward to the next one.
Awesome. Yeah, we're getting more practical, but also beautifully, we're back in our theory cell era, and I'm here for it. So thanks, Mike. Thanks, everyone, for listening. God bless.